everyone, Kristina Werner here. Welcome to another 5 ways in 5 days video. Today we are focusing on Distress Embossing Glaze. Now this is an embossing powder that has color to it, but it's also transparent. So it's great for a lot of fun, colorful techniques. So I'm going to show you 5 ways to use embossing glaze in this video, and then I'm going to be incorporating those onto 3 cards. So I wanted to show you exactly what this looks like when you open it up. It looks very similar to any other embossing powder. If you've used embossing powder before, think of it like a clear embossing powder, but with color or tinted. It's really, really fun, and it has a nice glossy finish when you heat it up. So this first technique I'm going to show you is all about taking advantage of that transparent quality of the embossing glaze. We're going to be overlapping the embossing colors so that we have additional colors on our background. I'm starting out with this 6x6 cling stamp from Simon. This is the diagonal stripe stamp, and I'm using some smoke ink just to get a nice pattern on the background. Now this is going to really show through all of that transparent embossing glaze. The pattern will show right through all of that color, and it's going to give an additional kind of element to our background. So after I stamped that a few times to make sure I had a solid line, I then hit it with my heat tool just to speed along the drying process. Because we are embossing, we don't want that embossing powder to go in areas where we don't want it to. So you want to make sure that before you go in and start the embossing step, that everything is completely dry in your background. So I double checked it here, just put some powder onto that background, and it worked out great. Now, this first time I embossed, I didn't have a very good coating of ink. My Versamark pad was a little dry, so I re-inked it and then I applied again. So this is essentially 2 layers of this embossing glaze. This is the color Picked Raspberry, such a pretty bright pink magenta shade. It's one of my favorites when I actually use distress inks or re-inkers for painting. So I happen to know that Picked Raspberry, Squeezed Lemonade, and Mermaid Lagoon are 3 colors that when you combine them, they make a beautiful, bright, and vibrant rainbow. So those are the 3 shades of embossing glaze that I'm going to use today. So after I had 2 layers of that Picked Raspberry embossing glaze on my background, I just funneled in the rest of that embossing powder back into the jar. So I'm taking my Versamark pad and I'm smushing it directly down onto my stamped background once again. And this time I'm overlapping the Picked Raspberry area. And I'm going to apply Squeezed Lemonade right over top. This powder is only going to apply to the areas where I've applied that Versamark ink, and then I can tap off the excess. And as I heat this with my heat tool, you'll see that the areas where it's just the Squeezed Lemonade on its own, it's a nice vibrant yellow, but where it overlaps that Picked Raspberry, it almost turns more of like a tomato red shade. It's a little bit hard to see when you only have 1 layer of the Squeezed Lemonade, but I'm actually going to apply 2 layers so that it has that same thickness as the Picked Raspberry that's on its own at the top. So I'm applying more of that Versamark ink and then sprinkling on that Squeezed Lemonade powder. I'll tap off the excess once again, and then I have a more intense color shift to that tomato red. For this last area, I'm inking up with Versamark. I'm going to be applying Mermaid Lagoon. So I'm sprinkling this on, and right away you can see that the yellow and blue shade are going to make a green color. So in essence, out of just 3 embossing glaze colors, we actually have 5 colors here. But I'm going to add 1 more here at the end. But before I do that, I'm going to do another layer of the Mermaid Lagoon, just putting that ink right over the top once again, and then applying the Mermaid Lagoon embossing glaze. You can see that the more layers of embossing glaze you add, the more intense color you get. It's a pretty faint tinted color at first, but the more layers you add on, the more intense color you get. All right, so here's that additional color. I thought, you know what? I've got a lot of that Picked Raspberry at the top. Let's just do 1 layer of Mermaid Lagoon and see if we get a purple shade. And it's the most beautiful, vibrant purple. So now 3 colors of embossing glaze have created 6 colors on my background. I'll put that Mermaid Lagoon back into the jar, and then that background is finished. It's nice and glossy. I'm going to set this aside until I'm ready to make it into a card. For my second technique, I'm using the friendship text background, and I'm doing the same thing I did with that diagonal stripe background. I just want a texture to go underneath all of that embossing glaze that I'm going to be adding to it. So this is the second way to use embossing glaze. I'm using the bold geometric stencil from Simon, and I'm going to be applying the embossing glaze powder over top of some distress grit paste. This is the translucent grit paste, so it has that same transparent quality. So we're going to be able to see the stamped background through the paste and the embossing glaze. I'm going to open up this jar of the translucent grit paste and then just use a palette knife to smear this onto my background. Now, I've seen Tim Holtz demonstrate this particular technique, and his grit paste has a very textured look to it. I'm not that gal. I want a really clean, glossy surface on this. So I'm going to frost this cake and get it as smooth as possible before I peel up that stencil. So I'm taking some time and really running my palette knife over that stencil, and then I'm going to scrape off the excess back into the jar. Now, here's a tip that I actually learned from Tim, and it makes a lot of sense. Before you close up your jar, get some cling wrap or saran wrap. I'm using some Glad press and seal. And you're going to put it right over that paste in the jar and make sure it's pushed down and touching the actual paste. Clean off that lid and then close up the jar tight. And that's going to help the paste from drying out too quickly. So I peeled up that stencil and I'm left with this texture. Now, don't leave it on its own. You're going to walk away for a minute and get that stencil into some water so that you can clean it off later. Do that right away. But then you're going to apply the embossing glaze powder right over the top of that texture paste. And the texture paste is wet, so it's going to grab that powder and hold on to it wherever it's applied. You can definitely kind of pinch the powder between your fingers and apply a very small amount if you want. I'm not that gal. I don't like to get my hands dirty. So I actually just very carefully tipped the jar and sprinkled some of these colors on. I used the same 3 colors as I did before, but I'm going to actually add a 4th shade. I'm going to bring in some Sealess Preserves. Sealess Preserves, I think, is one of my most used colors out of the whole Distress line of all the different colors. It's just this most beautiful red violet shade. It's just great. I love it. So after I had all the powder sprinkled on, then I tapped my cardstock to get rid of all that excess. And I'm going to set this aside to dry. And as far as the embossing powder that's left on my paper, unfortunately, those colors are all mixed, so I did have to discard it. But while this dried, I set a timer for 30 minutes. I believe you could probably get by with just 10 to 15 minutes. I think it says that on the jar of the grit paste. But I wanted it to dry completely and make sure I had a nice dry surface for when I came to heat up the embossing glaze. If you do heat it up and emboss when that texture paste or the grit paste is not fully dry, it'll bubble up, which is a cool effect and it does look really, really neat. But I wanted to have it as smooth as possible. So I'm running my heat tool over this and you can see that everything turns glossy. The powder does melt. It's a little bit hard to see on camera, but I'm going to show you this texture up close. It has this really puffy quality, and it's because it has that grit paste underneath. And you can still see that stamped word pattern in the background. I think it's such a cool effect of layering different textures and colors, and it's a really cool effect. So I'm going to set this aside until I'm ready to make my cards, and we're going to go on to my third way to use embossing glaze. And this is with an embossing folder. I'm using the Floral Clusters 3D embossing folder from Simon Says Stamp, and I'm also using Simon's lavender cardstock. I've spritzed both sides of my cardstock and then placed it inside that embossing folder and then run that through my die cutting machine. And the result is the most beautiful textured background with 3 flowers on it. I think it's just beautiful. So I'm going to hit this with my heat tool just because it is still a little bit damp because I spritzed it with some water. That does help the texture to come through a little bit stronger, and I do recommend that. So now I'm going to take some Iris positively saturated ink on a ink blending tool. And this is a mini round blending tool, just the regular flat foam, not the domed. And I'm running it over this texture, over this cardstock. Now this Iris color is going to intensify the purple and really bring out that texture and that design. I think it looks really, really neat, especially when we start applying the embossing glaze on top. I also went around the outside edge and kind of intensified the ink just on the edge. I'm going to be using Kitsch Flamingo Embossing Glaze. This is a nice pink shade, and it's going to pick up that purple underneath, and the area in the center where I didn't really apply much of that ink, it's going to be a lighter shade than what's on the outer edge because I inked up the outer edge already. I'm using the Distress Embossing Dabber. Just apply an embossing ink over that entire surface. And also the purple ink that I've already applied is going to help that powder stick as well. So I'm sprinkling on all of that embossing powder. I'm coating the entire background with this Kitsch Flamingo embossing powder. And you'll be able to see how this embossing glaze changes the color of what's underneath. It's a really cool effect. If you're looking for a particular shade and you want it to be a little bit warmer or a little bit cooler, you can put embossing glaze on top. It's a really neat effect. So I'm going to tap off the excess, and then I'm going to use my heat tool to heat set this entire background. And you can see that it does, looks kind of pink right now, but it does go back to more of that purple shade. But the area in the center looks more pink. And that's because I didn't have any of that iris ink on the center. I think it's such a cool effect. You get this two-tone thing, a little bit of a warmer glow pink in the center, and then you have that more purple on the outer edge. And when you tip it in the light, it just glistens. It's so beautiful. I'm going to funnel the remainder of this powder back into the jar. Sometimes it puffs up because you've added a lot of air. So if that happens and it doesn't look like it's going to fit, you can tap your jar on the surface of your mat or whatever, and it'll kind of settle back in. So that was the third way to use embossing glaze. Here is a fourth way to use embossing glaze. I'm going to use this background stamp in that same smoke color to go on the background, and I'll stamp that down onto some white cardstock. And then we're going to go in and just start playing with some Distress Oxide inks. I'm using two different colors for this background. I've got Mustard Seed and Worn Lipstick, and I'm just smushing that onto a slick surface. And then I'm going to spritz the puddles of ink so that they're a little bit more fluid so I can get a nice background. We're doing a wet Distress Oxide background and running that through the ink. I'm going to add a little bit more ink to different areas. I thought that was just a little bit too much yellow. So I'm going to smush my Worn Lipstick ink pad down on the corner of this mat. By the way, this is the replacement nonstick surface for Tim Holtz glass media mat. So I'm putting more of that Worn Lipstick on, running my paper through those different puddles of ink until it gets to a point where I think it looks pretty good. And then I'm just going to speed along the drying process by using my heat tool. And that's going to dry this entire surface. Now, I did not use watercolor paper for this. This is regular white cardstock, so it does warp quite a bit. I probably should have used watercolor paper, but I didn't. I'm now using the Spring BOHO Circle, and I'm going to be putting this right over the top. So this is our fourth way to use embossing glaze, and we're going to be using embossing glaze directly through a stencil. Now, I did use a stencil with grit paste before, but this one's just going to be a little bit more straightforward. We're applying that embossing ink, or Versamark ink in this case. We're applying that with a mini round blending tool and pouncing it right over top of the stencil. So I'm pouncing that in, making sure I get that whole area. And then I'm going to remove the stencil and start sprinkling on my embossing glaze. Starting with Kitsch Flamingo once again, just kind of sprinkling that on just a tiny bit. And then I'm going to switch colors and bring in a more intense shade. Now this is Abandoned Coral, And I'm going to add that on kind of more near the center corner area. And then I'm going to switch back to Kitsch Flamingo and finish off the rest of this circle area. So it's not really showing much of that stenciled design quite yet, but I'm going to pick this up from the surface that I'm working on and then tap the back side. You can see that kind of makes the powder jump around, and it's going to apply that powder to any areas where I missed it before. Fortunately, those powder colors are mixed, so I just had to discard the excess, but not a huge deal because I used so little of that embossing glaze powder. So I'm using my heat tool to heat set that. You can see that it has a really cool effect on those colors that are underneath and also that stamped texture. I'm going to add some more color on top. This is Walnut Stain, regular Distress ink. And because it's an embossing powder, the embossing glaze, it's going to resist any of this brown color. So this is a little bit of a bonus technique. You can do emboss resist with embossing glaze, and it shows the pattern underneath. It preserves everything underneath the embossing glaze and resists any of that color that you apply on top. I'm applying it just to kind of the bottom and a little bit onto the sides. And then this background is almost done, but I thought it needed a little more brown texture. So with the ink that's just sitting on my surface here, I'm actually going to hit that with my Distress sprayer, just a little bit of water, and then kind of run my background through the puddles, just like I did with that first layer of color. And this is just going to add a little bit of more intense brown shades to some areas near the top. I just wanted a little bit of extra texture, and I saw that ink sitting on my surface and thought, why not? So I dried that, and then here we are with the finished background. So now this is one of the backgrounds that I completed during this video that I did not turn into a card. So if you have a suggestion for how to turn that background into a card, leave it down below in the comments. I didn't have time to create this into a finished project in this video, but I think it definitely warrants a finished card. So for my fifth way to use embossing glaze, I'm going to keep it really simple and create a die cut greeting. I'm using the holding space die cut for this, and I've put a little bit of tape runner adhesive on some cardstock and then used my fingertips to remove some of the stick. I just want it to be sticky enough to hold this die cut in place so that I can apply some Versamark ink. I then moved that die cut onto some scratch paper that's just going to catch the embossing powder, and I'm using that same Kitsch Flamingo embossing glaze, sprinkling that over the top, and then I'm going to pick it up and tap off the excess. I'm going to hold the die cut with some tweezers, and I'll just tap that off. So this first layer of embossing glaze, because it's on some really thin words, it does kind of look a little bit mottled, but I'm going to do, I think I ended up doing 3 layers of embossing glaze. So for each layer, this pink shade gets more and more intense, and you can really start to see that glow come from the different layers. So this is layer 2 after it's been completely melted. I'm going to add some more Versamark ink on top and then add a 3rd layer of that Kitsch Flamingo embossing glaze. I'll pick that up with my tweezers and then hit that with my heat tool. So after that was done, I'm left with this beautiful glossy texture on top of this die cut greeting. To make it stand out a little bit even more, I've die cut that same greeting out of 3 layers of white cardstock, and I'm using some liquid glue to adhere the layers together. This is going to give almost like a faux chipboard effect to my greeting. It's going to help it be more substantial and really stand out. And then finally, I glued the embossed greeting right on top. I'm going to put some pressure down on this. I'm just using a paperweight to hold it in place. You could also use a stack of acrylic blocks or a book or anything like that. But because that embossing glaze can warp the paper just a little bit, it needed a little bit of help to adhere down. Okay, so let's turn these into cards, starting with that embossing folder background. And I'm using the Windswept leaves dies, and I've cut that out of some vellum, placed it on my background, and then adhered the embossed greeting right on top. Now I did cut this whole background down just a little bit so that I could put it on some purple cardstock. This is that same lavender cardstock. I wanted that pale purple shade to kind of show around the edge, so I trimmed off about 1/4 inch off each dimension. And there's the first card. Super easy and quick once you have that amazing background done. All right, so I'm going to move on to the overlapped and striped background. I'm using the large happy birthday die cut or dies, mostly because that really colorful background just screams happy celebration. So I knew it had to be happy birthday. I've die cut the die 3 times out of black cardstock. This is Hero Arts pitch black cardstock. And I've layered those up just like I did with the previous greeting. And then I'm taking my white layer that I've cut and I'm going to adhere that on top, but it's going to be offset just a little bit so that the black serves as a shadow. And it's really going to help this greeting stand out on top of that super colorful background. So I'm placing this on top and you can see I'm just offsetting it just a tiny bit so that the black creates a little bit of a shadow. I'm going to put some liquid glue on the back of this greeting, just putting on little dots most everywhere. And then I'll place that directly over top of my very colorful background. I'm using iridescent clear drops from Pink Fresh, and I'm putting those kind of sporadic and scattered around my greeting. I'm adhering that with some more liquid glue and making sure those are all glued down before moving on. And there is the finished card. Super colorful. It just screams celebration to me with the glossy texture and those additional elements. All right, for my third card, I'm using the From the Heart Messages stamp set from Simon, and I'm stamping one of the greetings in All Too New Obsidian ink. This is a black pigment ink, and I'm going to coat that greeting with some clear embossing powder. This is Icicle embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. So I'll sprinkle that on, and then it's going to give the Sending Love a glossy texture. I wanted to mimic the glossiness from the embossing glaze in the greeting itself, so that's why I decided to use clear embossing powder on top. Now that stamp set from the Heart Messages, it coordinates with the nested round hearts dies. So I used one of those heart dies to cut out the greeting. And then here I'm using some black cardstock and the mini hearts party dies to cut out lots of black little hearts that I'm going to have scattered around that main greeting area. I picked up each one of those hearts with this, I think this is the Pick and Pierce tool. I think this is what this one is. I picked those up and then put some liquid glue underneath. And then you'll be able to see all of that beautiful glossy texture on both the greeting and that grit paste. Such a cool effect with all that texture. So here are all 3 cards showing the different ways to use embossing glaze. And here's that 5th technique that I didn't have a chance for. Remember, let us know down in the comments if you can think of a great way to use that background. Once again, everything I've used today in the video is available at simonsthestamp.com, so you'll see links down below in the video description, or if you're at the Simon blog, you'll see those listed down below at the bottom of the blog post. Click through those, do some shopping, check out some embossing glaze, and I hope you'll give some of these techniques a try. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Kristina Werner, and I will see you in another video very soon.
Hi there, I'm Heidi, Simon's mama and founder at simonsaysstamp.com. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you like what you just saw, be sure to press the thumbs up and subscribe to see more great content.